Hey, it's 3.2 step 3, and this is the video about changing and misleading narrators. Since you're probably going to write your essay about this, you're going to want to tune in, take some notes. First of all, how is this literary aspect defined? Well, a narrator is a storyteller, right? And for this book, we are going to see that there are multiple narrators and several storytellers. So when you're talking about changing and misleading narrators, you can think about anyone who tells a story, all right? Any storyteller can be included. However, we want to mostly focus on the main narrators, all right? And there are most of the narrators of the book are two different narrators, okay? And then within those, we have some stories that are told by characters. And so it's like the narrator is allowing a character to tell a story within the larger narrative. And you'll see it when we get to it. I'll point it out to us, okay? So for the most part, we will focus on the main narrators. Every once in a while, we'll talk about other storytellers. And we're going to focus on narrative point of view. Writers think about the point of view of the narrator in the same as a perspective, right, from which the story is being told. And so they take into account when they tell a story this point of view. Where is this narrator? How are they looking at the events in the story? And what angle are they taking on those events? You can kind of think of it like a photographer, right? Someone who's taking a picture. And the picture's going to look different if you hold the camera up high rather than down low. If you do a zoom rather than, a pano shot. So it depends where that lens from the camera is looking out on the world. The same is true with a narrator. So you've probably already talked about, or you probably remember talking about pronoun point of view. That's the first important aspect of narrative point of view when we are analyzing literature. And so that's a key aspect. So let's talk about that one first. And then there's another one that I want us to talk about, okay? So pronoun point of view, first, second, and third person. Does that sound familiar to you? Let's do a quick reminder of what these are. The first person point of view, you're using, the narrator is using I or we. So in, Herman Melville's classic novel, Moby Dick, that's a book that uses first person. The famous first line is, "Call me Ishmael." So the narrator is saying, me, my name is Ishmael, right? The second person point of view isn't used typically over an entire book. It's used in like really short sections because it's using you and your pronouns. But there's an example here of Bright Lights Big City that uses the you point of view. And there's a couple other books that have been written in second person. I always think of the Choose Your Own Adventure books, right, that are written in second person, where you encounter a tunnel that has a bright light at the other end of it. Do you pursue the tunnel, or do you turn around and go back where you came from? Turn to page 6 if you pursue the tunnel, So that is also an example of second person point of view. And then third person is using she or it. And I have the reference here to Leo Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina, which begins, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." And that narrator is not talking about my family, but it's talking about other people's families. So using he, she, it. All right. There is another aspect, though, that is important besides pronoun point of view. And it is level of omniscience, okay? Now, this is only true for third person narrators. So the first thing to do when you are determining what or who a narrator is to determine the pronoun point of view. Is it first, second, or third? It's probably going to be first or third, right? And in this book, the very first chapter is actually in the third person point of view. So once you've determined if a narrator is a third person narrator, then you determine the level of omniscience. Omniscience means all-knowing. And so an omniscient narrator is all-knowing. And this narrator is like an eye in the sky and sees everything that's happening. And this narrator can jump inside of every character's head and tell the reader what they're thinking. And it can move sometimes between, places and time, and it seems to have this kind of magical capability, okay? If it's limited in omniscience, that means that the narrator, the third person narrator, only can access the thoughts of one character or maybe a couple of characters. And so it's kind of stuck inside of one character or maybe two characters' heads for the most part. It doesn't do a lot of mind jumping and telling us a lot of different thoughts from a lot of different characters. So here's another visual to help you understand the difference between omniscient and limited. In omniscience, we got that eye in the sky, right? It can get inside of his head, it can get inside of her head, it can get inside the tree's head. And it has more objectivity, not as much bias or preference, full knowledge of all characters and situations, all right? The limited third person, limited omniscient third person narrator only knows what's going on inside one person, and maybe it's two, but for the most part we're just inside of one person's head, and so the perspective is limited. So we're just inside dude's head here. Now it's a lot like first person in that respect, right? But third person is really still using the she, he pronouns. So even though we can get inside of dude's head, we're not hearing I am a dude with orange hair and orange pants, right? We would hear he is a dude with orange hair and orange pants, but then we would also hear his thoughts. And this lady next to me with the orange dress is pretty hot, he thinks, So we would be able to access his thoughts. All right. So let's talk about the book we are reading. What is an example in the first reading? Well, first of all, the first chapter, called The Things They Carried, is a third person point of view. And it's limited in omniscience mostly to Lieutenant Jimmy Cross. We are mostly in his head, hearing about, how he's thinking about Martha and what she might be doing or not doing, right? And then also Ted Lavender and his death and how Cross is going to deal with that. So here's an example. It was very sad, he thought, the things men carried inside, the things men did or felt they had to do. It's on page 24. So we are inside of his head. We hear his thoughts, but it's not Lieutenant Jimmy Cross saying, I thought this, right? Then it would be first person. We do also get inside of Kiowa's head briefly, which is really interesting. And you'll have to do some thinking about this aspect as you are working on making sense of the book once you finish it. Here's an example from page 17. Shrugging, Kiowa pulled off his boots. He wanted to say more just to lighten up his sleep, but instead he opened his New Testament and arranged it beneath his head as a pillow. I think it's only on page 17 when we can access Kiowa's thoughts, but let me know if you find any other examples. All right. The rest of the first reading is in the first person, and it's the first person point of view, and the narrator is Tim O'Brien, the character, right? So he narrates love from his point of view in the first person. Many years after the war, Jimmy Cross came to visit me at my home in Massachusetts, and for a full day we drank coffee and smoked cigarettes and talked about everything we had seen and done so long ago, all the things we still carried through our lives. So that is using it's the first person because it uses the me pronoun, and we find out by the end of the chapter that it is Tim O'Brien, the character, talking. How about from Spin On page 30, I remember a little boy with a plastic leg. So we have the use of the I there. We know that it is first person. On the rainy river, this is one story I've never told before. So these chapters are all told from the first person, and it's Tim O'Brien, the narrator, doing the narrating. What are some effects of this literary aspect? Well, first of all, the fact that we hear from multiple viewpoints gives us this feeling of seeing things from multiple angles, right? It's a multiplicity of understanding and knowledge. We see things from Tim O'Brien's point of view. We see things from Jimmy Cross's point of view. We see things a little bit from Kiowa's point of view. Multiple points of view show us a bigger picture, right? The reader also is misled at times. This comes up later in the book when we get to the other 2 chapters that are also in third person. There's only 3 chapters in the book that are in third person. We'll see if you can find them. I'll help you find them as we get reading. But what we're going to find out is that the third person narrator leads us astray and doesn't tell us the whole truth at times, maybe even lies to us. You'll have to decide. And when the narrator does that, well, that makes us feel like there is no one point of view, no one truth, even if we can't trust the narrator. It makes us question the details of the story and ask, okay, who's telling this story before we're going to believe it? Or who's telling this story? Now we'll know kind of how it's been spun, how they will spin it, how they will slant the truth to their side. And it makes us question why we're lied to or given a different version of the truth. Why is the storyteller spinning the truth this way? What is it they're trying to cover up? What is it they're trying to do by not being completely honest? How about connection to the themes? Well, the first one's pretty obvious, right? The power of voice to create truths. The storyteller has the ultimate power. The narrator has the ultimate power because they are making up everything, right? And that's being told. And now, of course, if you take it one more level, it's the author who has the ultimate power, right? They are choosing the narrator and, you know, what that narrator is going to tell us. But it makes us, you know, I think what you need to do to determine the point that O'Brien is making is to ask this question: what truth does the storyteller create and why? When you're thinking about the burden of war stories, that theme, what is the impact of war on the psyche, memory, and beliefs of the soldiers in Vietnam? And, you know, how is it that that burden of having been through these traumatic experiences makes them tell a different version of the truth? Innocence, guilt, and redemption. This is key with yours, and it'll become clearer as we read the book. How does the narrator distance himself from the truth in order to deal with his guilt? And then the last one, story and imagination as creative forces. How do the characters tell stories to get at the real truth? We'll hear O'Brien talk about this a lot, that sometimes what actually happened isn't important. The story that's created is the real truth because it accesses emotions, feelings that the storyteller wants to communicate. And so we'll dig into that deeper as we get going. I know right now it feels a little bit out there, right? And then it gets us to that final question: what is the difference between story and truth? Okay, so I hope you enjoy watching for this as we read. You can look for, you know, multiple storytellers, not just the 2 other chapters that are told by a third-person narrator, but you know, those multiple storytellers and what stories they tell and why they tell it the way they do. Enjoy!